My name's Dr. Hannah Thomas, and I'm a research fellow and psychologist who researches the effects of bullying among children and adolescents. Today's presentation is about understanding the state of the evidence that we currently have on bullying and best practice in terms of intervention, but also in understanding, well, where to from here and how can we better strengthen our prevention and early intervention approaches for bullying. Before I begin though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered here today and those of you who are joining us online, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today's presentation is firmly grounded in the evidence base for bullying victimisation in a global context. So obviously bullying is a global challenge. It's an ongoing public health issue, and it's a policy and intervention focus for many countries all around the world. It's experienced across sex, age and country, and there's really strong evidence to suggest that it's more similar than different across these contexts. We also know from a 20 to 30 plus years of research that any involvement in bullying is associated with adverse outcomes, particularly mental health outcomes. So our approaches to intervention really require us to have a fundamental understanding of why bullying even occurs in the first place. And that's what I'd like to speak to more of today. And really I pose the provocative or radical question to you all is that if we're able to reduce bullying, victimisation in childhood and adolescence, we might actually be able to make a meaningful difference to the reduction of mental health disorders in our population. So this is firmly grounding this presentation today. These statistics might be familiar to you. Mental illness is the leading cause of disability among children and young people in that age bracket 0 to 24. 50% of mental disorders onset by the age of 15 and 75% by the age of 25. So this age of onset statistic is vital in being able to guide our policy and practice. In Australia, we know that the prevalence of mental disorders among children and young people and adults is stable, despite significant investment in this space. What I speak to today is really focusing on the prevention and early intervention of these problems. So our best evidence in Australia at this point in time is that approximately 1 in 7 children and young people, or around 14%, have experienced a mental disorder in the past year. So these are clinically diagnostic levels of symptomatology. So here's a brief overview of what I'd like to cover today. We'll begin by looking at the definitions. We'll talk about how common bullying is in terms of the prevalence, look at the outcomes or consequences of exposure to bullying, as well as really firmly ground our discussion in the prevention and intervention approach. So there's great consensus now on what the definition of bullying is. And bullying is really distinguished from other forms of peer aggression by these 3 defining characteristics: intention to harm, repetition over time, and an imbalance of power. And it's these 3 core characteristics that make bullying a much more harmful exposure than one-off instances of mistreatment, and they make it distinguishable from conflict among peers as well as banter among friends. This definition really excludes the perpetration of violence by adults towards children, and when we talk about peer bullying, we're also excluding violence that might be between siblings and dating partners, though they are often very much related. Now, this definition of bullying really underpins all of the research, policy and practice that comes forth, and it's important that we're all on the same page about what is the concept or the behaviour that we are trying to define. In terms of involvement in bullying, we typically think about it from these 3 different perspectives. So in a cross-section of time, at one time point, a young person might report experiencing victimisation or being bullied. They might report perpetration or bullying others, or they might report both. And what we know is that overlapping group that experience both forms of victimisation and perpetration, tend to have the worst mental health outcomes. And really, it's about 30% of those who experience victimisation, or flipped the other way, it's 50% of those who do perpetrate bullying at one point in time. Many of you might be familiar with the different forms of bullying. Traditionally, we term physical, verbal, social, or relational forms of bullying as those face-to-face or in-person forms of bullying. And in my presentation today, I call those traditional forms of bullying. And of course, cyberbullying is bullying that extends to the technological world that young people are accessing and have contact with, and this can be through the internet or mobile phones. There are some subtle differences between the types of bullying behaviour that can occur online versus in person, but for young people these days, that world, that online and offline world is very much integrated, and they really don't see a difference between those two worlds, which maybe adults tend to. Of course, bullying behaviour can focus on often how the individual presents, key characteristics or features. And I've listed some of those examples in the bottom of this slide. Now, this is what we tend to term bias-based bullying, and we know that these forms of bullying are particularly harmful to young people because it's about something that they inherently can't change, and that's what makes it such a drastic form of social rejection. I return now back to the definition of bullying, and intention to harm is one of those core characteristics which we just spoke about. But often the interpretation of intention to harm is a difficult thing for outsiders to be able to interpret. So this is some research that we conducted a number of years ago now, in which I asked parents and adolescents to rate hypothetical bullying scenarios, and I asked them to say, how likely is this situation to be bullying? I gave them a whole different range of examples across those different forms of bullying, cyber, rumour spreading, exclusion, and then asked them what they thought about it. And what I did was I changed the interpretation of that intention to harm in those different scenarios. This is what we found. So over on the right-hand side, you can see the graph which I've circled in light blue, and this sort of shows us that, of course, when there's no intention to harm perceived by the victim or the perpetrator in this particular situation, people looking from the outside in don't really perceive it as bullying. But what we found is that when there's a congruence between what the victim is reporting and or observing and perceiving and what the perpetrator is perceiving or intending, then those scenarios are getting a much higher likelihood of bullying, which you might say, well, that makes sense. The reason why I've highlighted the blue circle there is because these are situations in which it's just the person who's being victimised who perceives that malintent. And these situations were much more likely to be rated lower. And I think this really speaks to the fact that really when it's just the victim who might be coming forward and saying, this is what's happening to me, but the perpetrator or the person aggressing towards the other person is not in agreement with that, then we find that we actually maybe don't quite really believe the person who's being victimised. Over on the other side of the graph, you can see different forms of bullying behaviour, and what you can see here is that the dip at the bottom is for those behaviours that were about exclusion. So exclusion was typically rated across adolescents and parents as a form of bullying that was less likely to be seen as bullying. And I think this is really important to take forward. Another study that we did based on some Victorian data that was 10,000 14-year-olds collected in around about 2009. We asked them about their experiences of bullying in the past few months. We asked them about name-calling, physical threats of harm, rumour spreading and exclusion. What we found was that all forms of bullying was associated with higher levels of depression and anxiety symptoms and reduced levels of emotional well-being compared to those who were not bullied. But what interestingly we also found was that social exclusion in particular was associated with the highest rates of depression and anxiety symptoms over and above the other forms of bullying, which I think speaks to the fact that really social exclusion is a form of rejection, which really hits home to our, and it's often something that we internalise very strongly. I'd like to now just talk about prevalence. So prevalence is a question I certainly get asked a lot of the time. How common is bullying? And really, the prevalence information is absolutely based on the measurement approach that's taken. And I think this meta-analysis really helps us to show what that means. So this research was conducted by a PhD student of mine a few years ago. in which she did a systematic review of the literature. She went out to all of the studies that had been conducted in Australia and tried to summarise, well, what overall is the prevalence of bullying in Australia? And what she was able to show was that across the victimisation exposure, approximately 15% of young people report being bullied in the last year, and around 5% or so report perpetrating bullying against their peers. When we looked at just a subset of that data and we looked at the data that was nationally representative, we see that the victimisation prevalence exposure just reduced slightly to around about 13%. So that gives you a little bit of an idea as to how common this experience is in Australia. I presented the data at the beginning of my talk on mental disorders, and based on the most recent survey of mental health and wellbeing on adolescents. And in this survey, we were able to include some questions on bullying victimisation, which was excellent. And again, this study really underpins what this meta-analysis has shown us, is that around about that 13 to 14% of adolescents 11 to 17 years report being victimised by their peers in the previous year. What I wanted to do after I'd examined this data was to understand, well, how much of this is traditional forms of bullying and how much of this is cyberbullying. And what we found was that overwhelmingly, young people are reporting traditional forms of bullying as the most common experience. Just under a third, or just over a quarter, experience both those traditional forms of bullying as well as cyberbullying, but very few experience cyberbullying alone, which leads us to the conclusion that really cyberbullying creates very few new victims, and it's more of an extension of those traditional forms of bullying into online spaces. In this study, we also asked young people how upsetting was this experience of bullying victimisation. 80% said that it was upsetting, and really alarmingly, 45% of this group of adolescents reported that they did not seek help, which I think is a really striking observation given all of the efforts that go into really trying to promote help seeking for bullying victimisation. And I think that speaks to the difficulty with engaging adolescents in building supportive relationships with trusted adults to be able to resolve these difficulties. So I really wanted to understand this a bit further. So I took this data and I looked at a range of other variables that we included in this survey. So I looked at the mental health symptoms. Some of you might be familiar with the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire. We asked them about self-harm and suicide attempts. We asked them about internet use and their perceived social support. And all of these factors were associated with not seeking help. Okay. But when we put all of these variables in together in a larger model, what we found was that in particular, it was their pro-social skills, high levels of internet use, and their perception of social support that actually explained the non-help seeking the most. So really what it comes back down to is these relational variables, things that impede positive relationships seem to be getting in the way of help-seeking behaviour. So what really are the takeaways? Well, of course, it means that school culture is important. School culture that's inclusive of all students, that has expectations of positive behaviour and encourages students to seek help, problem solve their experiences, is critically important. It also speaks to school engagement and trying to improve the school engagement among those adolescents who are particularly withdrawn or disconnected from their schools or peer groups, and helping them to build much more supportive relationships with their peers. It's also about increasing students' awareness or young people's awareness, so we can actually support young people to identify the warning signs in themselves as well as their peers that might be experiencing bullying, victimisation or mental health problems, and really help them to support them towards a help-seeking action. I think it also speaks to the engagement of parents, and so any approaches or strategies that can improve the relationship between adolescents and their parents are also likely to help increase help-seeking behaviour for bullying or for mental health difficulties. So moving back now to measurement approaches, our measurement is really important. The way we actually capture this information, this self-report information from adolescents, is going to inform whether or not our interventions are actually working or not. And so I really very much strongly argue that all forms of bullying need to be measured, and we need to be measuring both those victimisation experiences and those perpetration experiences. So this was largely the work that I conducted during my PhD, which was data collected from 1,200 high school students here in Queensland, aged 12 to 17 years, and we validated against a range of other bullying measures. And really what we were trying to understand was, what's it like to be able to measure these specific forms of bullying, and can that inform the measurement model moving forward? And what I found was that really, when you look at these victimisation and perpetration behaviours, you are able to come up with a prevalence rate for different forms of bullying, which may be a helpful way forward in being able to address this issue with different age groups across the adolescent developmental spectrum. So measurement is very important.